So in the previous part of this lecture, we talked about some age-dependent changes that happen in both the mouth and the stomach. And now we're going to finish by talking about some of the age-dependent changes that happen in a latter part of the gastrointestinal tract, the small intestine, right? And so the main function of the small intestine is mostly in absorption. There's a small amount of digestion that happens sort of at the beginning of the small intestine, but mainly its function is to absorb nutrients. And when food that is digested in sort of this liquefied form called chyme enters into the beginning of the small intestine, that chyme actually signals accessory organs like the pancreas and the gallbladder to secrete digestive enzymes that further help to digest the food or the chyme in order to more adequately absorb different nutrients. And so the gallbladder will secrete bile salts into the small intestine. The pancreas will promote secretion of amylase for further carbohydrate digestion, as well as proteases and lipases. And this breaks down all of the components still in this kind of chyme mixture within the small intestine into their monomers, right? So amino acids, monosaccharides like glucose, fatty acids, and vitamins and minerals that can then be absorbed within the small intestine. And the structure that makes the small intestine so good at absorbing nutrients is its mucosa or lining. And the mucosa is organized into villi and then microvilli on top of that. And what a villi is basically little tiny folds or finger-like projections that are in the lumen, that extend into the lumen or the kind of empty space of the small intestine. And what all of these individual finger-like projections or villi do is they increase the surface area of absorption within the small intestine. Okay, and so you can see the mucosal lining down here and this finger-like villi projection coming off of it. And then in each villi, there are epithelial cells containing microvilli. So there's even more finger-like projections on each individual villi that it further increase the surface area for absorption. And what you'll notice is that there's also blood vessels within each villi, and that is where your nutrients get absorbed too, right? So nutrients are absorbed from the lumen of the intestine into the bloodstream. And there's several different ways that this happens, depending on the nutrients or molecules that we're talking about. Some are absorbed passively via diffusion, and some require active transport or facilitated diffusion. But we're not really going to be super concerned about which types of transport are used. It's just important to note that we use all of them in order to bring nutrients into the bloodstream from the small intestine. And so over time, as we age, the number of villi, as well as the kind of replicative capacity of these cells, does not change with age. So there's not less villi. The surface area, therefore, remains the same for absorption within the small intestine. And the replicative capacity of the epithelial cells, which need to replace themselves as food kind of moves through the small intestine, that doesn't change either. They're able to replace themselves quite easily, even with increasing age. But what does change in the small intestine is the force of what are known as peristaltic contractions, or the kind of rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscle of the small intestine that basically squeeze food through it the same way you squeeze toothpaste out of a tube, right? There are rhythmic contractions, and these contractions can actually decrease in force with age, meaning that food can't move through as quickly and spends a longer time sitting in your small intestine than it would in a younger individual. And what we do know is that there is some changes in the rate of absorption of specific nutrients that can decline with age. One in particular is calcium. And so calcium requires vitamin D for its efficient absorption from the intestine into the bloodstream. And vitamin D levels decrease as we age, which makes calcium absorption also decrease as a result. And this is more common in women and can lead to osteoporosis, right, from that lack of calcium. But overall, there's not a massive change in the amount of absorption of like every nutrient within the small intestine as we age. And that might actually be because of this slower peristaltic or this less peristaltic force, right? So the longer food can stay in the small intestine, the more nutrients can be absorbed from it. And so it actually might not be a detriment to an older individual to have a slower peristalsis, because if absorption is declining, having the food available to the absorption machinery for longer might be kind of advantageous and might actually overall be why we don't see a major defect in absorption in aging individuals. But one thing that also does change with age is the makeup of the microbiome within the small intestine or the gut. And you can see here that between young and elderly individuals, there's a different makeup of the microbiome, these different phyla here. Right. So, for example, younger people have more actinobacteria, whereas elderly and older people have more proteobacteria and firmicutes in their gut microbiome. And the type of bacteria doesn't really matter for the purposes of this class, but what's important to know is that the microbiome's makeup and the types of bacteria in the microbiome change. And that might change the ability to digest certain molecules as well. And in addition, a change in the microbial diversity in the microbiome can lead to problems with the integrity of the intestine and actually create holes between what is normally sort of a tightly closed epithelia that separates this intestinal lumen from the rest of your body. That instability or that loss of intestinal integrity can allow things that should not be leaking from the lumen of your gut into the rest of your body and can actually lead to chronic inflammation as your body's immune defenses try to fight off what they think are invaders, and can create this kind of chronic inflammation of the intestine as well. And so that is one other age-dependent change we see in the digestive system. But overall, as a whole, and as I stated kind of in the beginning of the last lecture, the decline in function of the digestive system is relatively minimal compared to some of the other body systems as we age.